Hi all, welcome to the next episode of Talks 21. My today's guest is Rick Doblin. Hi Rick.
Hi Carol, so great to be with you.
Great to see you after a long time.
Yes.
Rick Doblin is one of the most influential figures in modern psychedelic science. As the founder of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, Rick Doblin crusades for the safe and legal use of psychedelics in therapy, to the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, not as counterculture, but as medicine. He is the founder of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, the organization that has led groundbreaking clinical trials using MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, including work with veterans, survivors of trauma, and communities affected by war. Rick's life work bridges science, psychology, policy, and human consciousness. His mission is not escapism, but healing. Not ideology, but evidence. At the time of global trauma, polarization crisis, Rick asks a deeper question. What if healing consciousness is not optional, but essential for humanity's future?
Dear Rick, I am so glad to welcome you to Talks 21. Maybe could you please tell us a little bit about history, how you got into psychedelics, what happened in 1986, such a big step, the heroic event that you did, and how it has evolved in these 40 years?
Yes, I'd love to talk about that. Well, really it was when I was 18 years old in 1972, after I had read Stan Grof's book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, that I had decided to focus my life on psychedelics. And that was 2 years after the criminalization of psychedelics in the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 and the shutting down of psychedelic research all over the world. Before that, I had been educated about the horrors of humanity. I'm Jewish. I was born in 1953 and had distant relatives killed in the Holocaust and early relatives that were trying to build a country in Palestine. My great-great-grandmother moved to Palestine in 1904 in order to die and be buried on the Mount of Olives, which happened in 1907. So I was raised on stories of the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel. And so I just thought, why are these people trying to kill me or people like me? So I was born into safety and support, but was aware that the larger world was dangerous. And when I was a young boy was the Cuban Missile Crisis between the US and Russia, where it seemed like now the Russians are trying to kill me, potentially. And
it was on the edge of the Third World War, yeah.
And we were told in school they called it duck and cover. You know, duck under your desk, cover your head, and maybe you'll survive a nuclear blast, which was not very reassuring. But it was now, the world is a very dangerous place. And my parents had been successful, and they told me that they would give me the freedom to do whatever I wanted to do. And I knew that I would have enough food and shelter. And so I started thinking about deeper threats in a way. Then what changed also was now, when I was 17, was the Vietnam War. And I was in one of the last years of the lottery for soldiers to go to Vietnam. And I'm like, now my own country wants to potentially kill me and kill other people. So I just started wondering, why all this? What is the story of humanity, of these constant wars, of these constant dehumanizing others? And I studied Gandhi and nonviolent resistance. And so I decided that what I would do for my confrontation with the Vietnam War is that I would not register for the draft. And I would be arrested for doing that, and then I would go to jail. And so I thought, I'll serve my country by going to jail and by costing the system money. And that's a completely nonviolent way to respond. My parents said, that's okay with them, but you'll never be able to be a doctor or a lawyer. My dad was a doctor, because you'll be a felon. And I thought, okay, I'll accept that. I'll have to figure out something else.
Felony?
Yeah, to not register for the draft. Yeah.
Okay.
And I had a passport, a driver's license, social security number, was paying taxes. I was on all the possible lists.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I ended up overestimating the efficiency of the government, and they didn't even notice that I didn't register. But all of that was thinking, like, what am I going to do with my life? All these people potentially want to kill me. I have my survival set up by my parents. And then I started experimenting with LSD. And the first time when I was 17 that I tried LSD, it was very difficult. I wasn't very emotionally mature, but it made me connect to a larger world outside of my life. And I had been very disappointed by my bar mitzvah when I was 13, because I'm the oldest of 4 kids. And I was told a story, this rite of passage is going to transform you into a man. That's what this idea was, that this is a ceremony now. You can be part of you count now as part of the prayers. You need 10 people in a minyan to have prayers, and now you would count once 13. But nothing happened. My bar mitzvah didn't change me. It was an outer rite of passage, but it didn't engage me initially. Mm-hmm. But when I tried LSD, I thought, this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. Uh-huh. Where do I fit in? Who am I? What is my connection to this larger world and to spirituality? But I was having all these difficult experiences because I had these intimations of something bigger, and it was bringing me to my feelings, to my emotions. I was so much up into my head before. But I was troubled by my inability to let go, my fear. It takes a lot of courage to let go during a psychedelic experience, to open up and to let your sense of self dissolve. And I didn't have enough of that kind of courage. And so I had a lot of difficulties. So I went to the guidance counselor at my school, and this was just one of those strokes of luck. He knew Stan Grof, and he had Stan Grof's book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, years before it was published. He had a manuscript copy of it. And so reading it, I didn't trust religion, but I trusted science. And so Stan was...
this is the time when you first learned about Stan Grof?
Yeah, in 1972.
Okay.
And after I read the manuscript copy, it was just, this felt like science looking at spirituality in a way. But the beautiful thing about Stan's work was it wasn't just theoretical, it was practical in that it was focused on therapy. How do you take this new understanding of the unconscious and of people's connections to something deeper, but also their connections to childhood traumas, to birth traumas, to confrontation with death? How do you work with all of these things to help people have a fuller life? So I felt that he had a reality check of therapy, so that other people, I would contrast this with John Lilly, who was an early psychedelic researcher, invented the flotation tank, but he was more interested in knowledge, and Stan was more interested in healing. Mm-hmm. So it was knowledge in service of healing. And I liked the fact, in a way, that because psychedelics had been so suppressed by the government, that made me think, why is Nixon so scared of psychedelics?
Because of freedom, right?
Because of freedom, because of questioning reality. So therefore, the fact that it was being suppressed made a big difference. Now, the other part of this is that I had a certain privilege. And so Primo Levi is a renowned Holocaust writer. He went through the Holocaust and he wrote about how people tend to think that social change movements, that revolutions start with the downtrodden, with the people that are oppressed, and they throw off their chains and then they struggle for freedom. But he says that's not usually the way it happens, because the purpose of oppression is to make it so you can't protest. You're always focused just on survival. And what he said is, actually, it's the privileged, for one reason or another, that are usually the ones that start the freedom movements.
Yes.
And so
the ones who do not suffer that much, who can give some energy, some attention to the change. Yeah.
So I felt that I had this privilege, and that I was just so lucky in where in this generational line I was born. So my great great-great-grandfather was a laborer, didn't even read and write. This is in Poland. My great-grandfather was a tailor.
Okay.
My grandfather was a teacher, left Poland in 1920, and my dad was a doctor. And my mother's family had built some businesses as well. So I had this privilege to do whatever I wanted. And so I thought, now psychedelics are connected to helping us feel connected to everything, to other people, and that you realize that we have more in common than we have separating us. And if you feel that and know that, it's harder to dehumanize others. So I wrote a letter to Stan, and I said, in 1972, I'd like to have your advice. How do I become a psychedelic therapist? Because I figured since I was going to be, at this point, I still thought I was going to be arrested and I would never have a normal job. But I figured I could be an underground psychedelic therapist. So at 18 years old, I said, I'm going to fight for freedom. I'm going to be an underground therapist. And Stan invited me to a workshop that he gave in 1972 with Joan Halifax, who he had just been married to. So I did a workshop with Stan. I did primal therapy. I did encounter groups. I did everything that I could do to elevate my consciousness. But I had the...
But that was without LSD, right? Because it was illegal at that point?
Yeah, all of this was illegal.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, all of it was illegal.
Yeah.
So I identified as a counterculture drug-using criminal.
Okay.
So at age 18, that's who I am. I'm a counterculture drug-using criminal. But the arc of my life has to go from counterculture to culture, from criminal to legal. But I've continued to find psychedelics useful and marijuana and other things useful through my life. So, and a fair amount of that has been accomplished. But it was this desire to try to make a contribution to a more peaceful world that led me to say, when I'm 18, I'm going to focus my life on psychedelics. But I wasn't mature enough, and I had the wrong idea that the more drugs you take, the faster you evolve. So I did lots and lots of drugs, but I got more confused. And I underestimated the importance of integration. Once I realized that I had to get grounded, I spent 10 years, I dropped out of school in my freshman year. I spent 10 years building things, building houses, building a handball court and getting grounded. And it took me 10 years before I was ready emotionally to put psychedelics first, to start again to become a psychedelic therapist for others. So it took me, as I said, like a decade to kind of, so then in 1982, I went back to college, and my first semester, I went to be with Stan Grof and Christina for a month-long workshop at Esalen in Big Sur. And that's where I learned about MDMA. And when I learned about MDMA, it was both a therapy, it was still legal, and it was a therapy drug under the name Adam, but had also just started to become ecstasy used in a public setting. So I knew that it was doomed. Eventually, this was Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan. And so I learned about LSD after the backlash. And now I'm learning about MDMA before the backlash, but I know that there will be a backlash. So that's where I started thinking, okay, I can get more politically involved.
So you knew there would be a backlash because it's just too good, right? So for the political powers, it's not advantageous for people to have this kind of loving experiences that it gives.
Yeah, and once it was being used in a public setting. So
it was sure.
By the time that I learned about it, about 500,000 doses had been used in quiet settings in people's houses as a therapy drug. But one of the persons that used it that way thought, aha, this is a good drug. I can make a lot of money. I'll turn it into ecstasy. I'll sell it in bars.
And then it's a problem,
And then it was inevitable. So from 1982, it was like the advocates for psychedelics had several years advanced knowledge. The government didn't know about therapeutic use. They just knew about the recreational ecstasy use. So we were able to introduce a variety of people to MDMA, either to try it or talk about it, to prepare them to be witnesses once the DEA would move to criminalize MDMA, which happened in 1984.
Yes.
And so I had worked with Brother David Steindl-Rast, a Roman Catholic monk, and he had used MDMA in the monastery to help him meditate. And he talked about to the media how MDMA helps people achieve a state of mind that monks will spend their whole lifetime trying to do. I worked with a Jewish rabbi who compared MDMA to the Sabbath. And so these were people willing to speak to the media. So we were winning in the court of public opinion, and we were winning in the court, trying to slow down the criminalization of MDMA. And in 1985, the DEA kind of freaked out because they could see we were winning, and so they emergency scheduled MDMA while the hearings were still going on. And then we won the hearings. The judge said MDMA should be a medicine. It should be illegal for recreational use, but it should be a medicine. And the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration rejected that recommendation. And we sued twice in the appeals courts, won both times. Eventually we lost. And I realized that the only way to bring MDMA back and to bring psychedelics back was through the FDA, was to go where the suffering is, go where the science is. And so I started MAPS in 1986.
Most difficult, the longest way, which is resistant though, robust. Yeah.
Yes. But it was really, because there's so much negative propaganda that people have learned about psychedelics. I was raised to say that if you did LSD 6 times, you were certifiably insane. And I believed, we were told that it hurts your chromosomes, that you're going to have deformed babies, that it's going to damage your brain in all these different ways. So, but these things didn't seem to be true. But when you can do science, one of the things about the media in America, and I think this is about the media most everywhere, is that they are reporting on scientific advances. So that we could have earned media that could be worth millions and billions of dollars over time that we'd never be able to pay for by doing science and getting results published in scientific journals. So I started MAPS as a nonprofit psychedelic pharmaceutical company with the realization at the time that it would never be profitable, that it would be a generic medicine, that the only way to do it was through philanthropy, that there was no patents on it. And that was my understanding when I started MAPS in 1986. I graduated college in 1987, and I wanted to get a clinical psych PhD.
Yes.
And learn how to do psychotherapy outcome research. But at this point, MDMA had just been criminalized, and nobody would let me in to graduate school. So a lot of times when I'm stymied and I don't know what to do, I decide to think about it while I'm high on marijuana.
Yes, it helps.
it really helps. So
it opens different perspectives sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. So under the influence of marijuana, and I remember exactly where I was in my house, where I had this idea that I saw a pattern in my life. So the pattern was, I want too much too soon. I'm impatient. I want too much too soon. And then I realized I want to do the science, but the politics is in the way. So therefore, I have to study the politics. And so I had read an interview with this, about drug policy with this professor, Mark Kleiman, who was at the school that I'd never heard of before, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And he had mentioned in this article our lawsuit against the DEA. So I called him up and I said, would you be my mentor? If I could get into the Kennedy School, I need help to figure out how to work within the system, how to open the door to psychedelic research. And Mark said, yeah, if you can get in, I would be glad to be your mentor. So I did all sorts of work to try to get in. I managed to get in. And that's where I shifted in my mind from learning to treat individuals for problems that they have to learning to treat a sick public policy. So from individual therapy to cultural therapy. So that was the kind of shift. And so that's where a big part of MAPS has been about public education.
Yes.
Because one of the statements that we've seen recently in the United States is that politics is downstream from culture. Meaning culture will permit what you can do in a political sense. It's also true in a scientific sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that really changing culture and finding ways to influence
Will change
people,
the politics, absolutely.
that's basically MAPS is trying to do science.
Yes.
Now, I then eventually got into the master's program. Then I got into the PhD program and did my, I almost had a job at the FDA. This was terrific. I applied for what's called the Presidential Management Fellowship. It's for people that want careers in the federal government. It's highly competitive, and they, like 150 people or so every year get chosen. And then you go in your different departments in the federal government, but then they pull you out every couple of months to meet all the people, special leadership training things. And I managed to get that.
Mm-hmm.
It was right around the time that the Supreme Court decided that the Native American Church could use peyote for religious services. So that was my topic. I talked about the Supreme Court case about religious freedom to use peyote. And I got accepted. And I tried to get a job at the FDA to learn how they work. And I went through about half a year of vetting with different people, layers of the FDA. I eventually met the person in charge of all drug research at the FDA. And they were all ready to hire me. And I thought, this is terrific. I'll work there for a couple of years, see how the FDA works. And then at the last minute, the FDA told the DEA that they were going to hire me.
And the DEA made the issue.
They said, no way. So I was willing to do two things that you'll probably appreciate that were very hard for me. The first one was to wear a suit and tie to work.
Yeah, that's kind of walk barefoot.
Right. So I was willing to wear a suit and tie to work, and I was willing to give up drugs for a couple periods of years.
Right. They are being checked. There's no way to...
So by the DEA saying that they would refuse to work with me, and then I couldn't get the job, the DEA saved me from giving up drugs.
That's very funny. That was which year? Was like 87?
This was now 1990.
Okay.
So I started in 88, graduated in 1990. And that's where I realized, and I'd met my, the woman that's my wife now, but she was just my girlfriend then. And she was 1 year behind me at the Kennedy School. And I realized that I needed more credibility. That I would go for the PhD. She said, I don't need a PhD. I'll just hire PhDs.
Oh, okay.
And so she's done that. She's executive director of a family foundation. She gives away a lot of their money, and she's hired PhDs. But for me, it was necessary. So I got my PhD in 2001, and I thought I knew, this is also a danger sign, I thought I knew everything I needed to know about making a drug into a medicine. But I missed something fundamental that I didn't learn until 2014.
Okay.
28 years after I started MAPS. My dissertation committee was a fellow that taught at Harvard Law School, but was the leading pharmaceutical lawyer in America. Used to be the FDA lawyer. My dissertation was all about how to work through the FDA. And what I learned about, in a way, accidentally, in 2014, was that there was a program that pharma companies never used. That's why I was never talked about it. But it was in 1984, 2 years before I started MAPS, Ronald Reagan signed into law a bill that would provide incentives for developing drugs that were off patent. And these incentives are called data exclusivity. So what it means is that you have exclusive use of your own data to make a drug into a medicine for 5 years, during which there can be no competition unless another company develops its own data. So that's how it's different from a patent. If you've got a patent, you own something.
I see.
But if you don't have a patent, you have use of your own data.
Yep.
And then it's you get an additional 6 months of data exclusivity if you do pediatric studies. So that's 5.5 years. And then it takes FDA around 6 months or more to review a generic application. So once I realized this, and data exclusivity is 10 years in Europe. So in the Czech Republic, it's 10 years for EMA. But I realized now there's a way to make money from selling MDMA. And I could tell a different story to the donors. The story would be that if you keep giving us money to make MDMA into a medicine, eventually we become self-funding, at least for this period of time. And we're not going to have to keep asking you for more money and more money. So the idea was now that we started the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, which was a pharmaceutical company, and I didn't want it to be like a normal company, which is all about the profits. But in America, there's the Public Benefit Corporation, which means that you maximize public benefit, you don't have to maximize profits. So in a normal company, the minority shareholders can sue the management if they're not maximizing profits. But in a public benefit company...
It's declared upfront, so it makes sense.
Yeah. So that's what I created. So the idea was the nonprofit 100% owns the for-profit, and then we will make money during this period of data exclusivity, and then with that money, we'll do global humanitarian projects, we'll do more public education, we'll train therapists, we'll do all these things. What happened later was that we've raised about $160 million in donations.
That's decent.
And then we were succeeding. We had all the money for the phase 2 and even the phase 3 studies. But then we hired the Boston Consulting Group, like McKinsey, in a way, to advise us on next steps. And this is where we went wrong. So what they said was that, looks like you're going to succeed, but how do you market the drug? Pharma companies would spend $60 or $70 million just on preparing to market a drug. And they should, if you're a normal pharma company, you would have started years ago to lay this groundwork. And so we could not, so the mistake was, I believe, the experts.
Yeah.
And then also we could not raise that much money from philanthropy in that short of a time. So that's where we started working with investors.
Yes.
And then the companies started separating and the incentives started separating. And I said this yesterday, but I think it's important for me to say now, is that the biggest mistake that I made was that we did not articulate and quantify what we mean by public benefit and link that to salaries, stock options, and bonuses so that the management of the company would be incentivized on public benefit, not just on profit. But once we took in investors and the company started separating and we had a board of directors of more traditional pharma people, when we started trying to put in public benefit metrics,
it was too late.
It was too late.
And you didn't have control anymore.
And they didn't have control and the company resisted it. So I think
so
that
was bad advice.
It was bad advice that I think when you try to do something innovative to apply traditional methods, doesn't always work. And in this case, one of the traditional methods was that they said, as you're getting close, you've got your data, now you're starting to negotiate with FDA for approval, we have what they call the quiet period of a year or more. And they started not responding to critics, not responding to the media. And so they lost the idea that we had done, at this point, 35 years of culture change that had really been key to doing the science. And then by ignoring the culture, when the critics come, you need to continually have a positive story of what you're doing and why. And so when the fears started coming, there was no response. So that's where I think the cultural narrative changed. Then the FDA said no, responding to the media more than to the science.
Yeah. I understand. And in fact, was it necessary to search for investors? Because MDMA, again, it is that special that maybe the word of mouth would have been enough once.
Well, it didn't seem that way. So when I first started, my thought was that look at all these people that are doing ecstasy now. If each of them would just send me $10.
That is so unique, right?
Yeah, I thought then we'll have all the money we need. But then I realized that they would rather use $10 to buy more ecstasy than send it to me. Because first off, they didn't think we'd ever succeed. Secondly, they didn't really care about medicine. And so we for the first 15 years, our major funders were people that were very comfortable with psychedelics, but also wanted to change the drug war. And so they saw, how do you deal with this incredible propaganda? Actually, when I first met my wife, when she was our very first date, which she didn't even say was a date, we went out for lunch. She said, we had a wonderful conversation about her psilocybin trip she had in college that she was still thinking about. But then at the end of this near the end of this lunch, he was saying, I just want you to know I would never want to have a real relationship with anybody like you. And I'm like,
Huh?
What's wrong with me? She said, well, you've done so much LSD, your chromosomes must be all screwed up. And I'm like, I can't believe you're saying that. I said, it may be premature, but let me defend my sperm. They're in good
So you
shape.
tested
This was our first discussion. And but it just goes to show super smart people.
But that's interesting, though. So clearly she showed very much interest, right? Because
But she believed all this propaganda. So how do you counteract all that? And that's through culture change and through science and through the media. And when you ignore that, the fears come to the surface. So, but my training was all in how to make it a drug through the FDA. I didn't really study commercialization.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I didn't know what I didn't know. And that's where I believe the experts. And that was the beginning of the downfall to where we ended up having people that now they don't even really want to be in charge of the drug plus therapy. So for me, what public benefit means is what's best for patients. And that means drug plus therapy, because it's not about the drug. I mean, that's one of the main messages I guess I'd like people to have, is that it's the context in which you use something. These substances they're like tools, and they can be harmful, they can be helpful, but they're not inherently spiritual necessarily. It's the safety, the support, the context, the understanding, and that's what really matters.
Yeah. So the FDA didn't approve the third phase, but now it looks like it will get finally approved.
Yes, I think so. So they basically didn't say no, they just said not yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so they want more information. And so I think the information from a new study will be mostly about safety, I think, but that's being negotiated, has been negotiated. So my guess is now here we are near the end of January 2026. My sense is that before this year is over, and maybe even within the next 6 months, the FDA will make some sort of provisional approval of MDMA with some requirement of additional research. And exactly what that provisional approval is, I don't know, or what the implications will be around the world, I'm not sure, but it will be helpful. And the company, because I was really disappointed by the management I went searching for new management. And so I found 2 people who have now invested in the company and have operational control. One of them is Antonio Gracias, and he happens to be one of Elon Musk's closest friends. And he was on the board of Tesla, SpaceX, but he's had his own growth with psychedelics. The other is Sir Christopher Hahn, who is a hedge fund person from London. And I just read an article last week about all the different hedge funds and which ones made the most money. And Chris Hahn's hedge fund was number 1, made over $20 billion last year.
Okay.
Yeah. But what Chris has done and what Antonio has done is they have invested from their foundations, not from their funds. So they're doing this more to bring this to the world. They have appointed traditional pharma people to run it, which was a disappointment to me. But nevertheless, what they've said is that once MDMA is approved by the FDA, that it should immediately be generic in all of Africa and in India and possibly elsewhere, and that they don't want traditional pharma patent games to make all these patents to sue generics to keep it from going generic, that after the 6 years or so of data exclusivity, they want it to be generic in the United States. And we talked about it a bit here, coming here, but a generic drug from MDMA in particular costs $5.
Nothing, right? The production cost is close to zero. Right?
Close to zero. And once you've got the upfront costs and you've got the methods and all of that, the marginal cost is pretty nothing. So the potential now is to bring MDMA as a generic into most of the world. And now that the company is well-funded, it will negotiate with FDA, I thought, what is the purpose of the nonprofit? What is our goal now? And that's where I came up with this new vision. What I've said is that if your visions are something, your deepest visions and your deepest dreams are something that you can accomplish in your own lifetime, then they're too small. You need...
Okay, that's an interesting question. Yes, it did happen. I can see that there are, okay, it's a little bit side note,
Please.
but the way I've already experienced what I call in Czech natsen, beyond dream, that things that happen even to me personally, they are just, some of them so great that I wouldn't have even imagined them.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so the reality is better than the deepest imagination.
Yeah, that can be, yes.
And it happen in reality. So it's kind of reverse, but I understand what you are saying. Maybe both is true, yeah? So maybe we can be extremely surprised that the reality surprises us with something that's even better than what we would have hoped for.
Yeah.
But at the same time, yes, we should be shooting for the skies, for the stars, yeah?
Yes, yeah. Do you know the religion called the Baha'i religion, what that is?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an offshoot of Islam. It's suppressed in most of the Muslim world.
Yeah.
But the Baha'i temple, the Baha'i religion is that all the different prophets are all talking more or less about the same thing. So it's like a global spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, where I grew up in Chicago, there's this Baha'i temple. And it took 3 generations to build it. And as I was growing up, I'm thinking, how could everybody think that far ahead? You know, but I was just really impressed. So it's one of the most beautiful structures I've ever seen, but it took 3 generations. Mm-hmm. So this idea of how do we come up with a big vision? So
yes.
For me, the global vision now is this net zero trauma in 27.
Yes, this is amazing. And we definitely talk about, maybe let me wrap a little bit for the audience because it's so intriguing. Beyond unbelievable what you have accomplished, right? You started in '86. Yeah. You started non-profit as a reaction to illegal use of MDMA, which may be such a great tool for healing.
Yeah.
MAPS, and now in 40 years, the fruits are will be soon. Hopefully this year we be out, and we can help to improve the trauma, as you say, the zero net trauma, the vision that our trauma should be decreasing, that we should be decreasing of trauma, not increasing, because what we can say in today's world, it's such a collapse. It's just a separatist society, so much trauma going on. Ukraine, Gaza, and other worlds, Africa. And there is no need for that, right? Because we are people, we have technology that we can take care of ourselves, but still we are creating these terrible traumas. So this, and maybe you can talk about it more, that we should be able to heal ourselves. So the trauma should be decreasing, not increasing, which has been very increasing the last years, especially.
Yes, and there's 2 basic kinds of trauma. One's that you experience in your life. Mm-hmm. The other is transmitted through your parents, multi-generational trauma through epigenetics. Yes. And so we work with a researcher, Rachel Yehuda, is at Mount Sinai University in New York and the Bronx VA. And she's done studies with Holocaust survivors and their children and identified certain epigenetic markers that are related to high stress, to fear. And what she's done in our MDMA research, and this is very preliminary, but it seems as if you are successfully treated for trauma, that these epigenetic markers can change also.
Mm-hmm. So during lifetime.
During your lifetime, because they are created during your lifetime, but they can be passed on.
Right, so you can heal them, and then your children do not need to have it anymore.
Yes. So we're doing a project. Actually, one of the things I'm doing here in San Diego is a project on MDMA for couples therapy. And we're interviewing underground MDMA therapists that are doing work with couples. And I came across this one husband-wife therapy team outside of Mexico City, and they specialize in working with couples who are preparing to have a child, so that they can do their own trauma work so that they don't pass on this multi-generational trauma to their children. So it's one of the most inspiring kind of uses of MDMA therapy. So net zero trauma by 2070, that's 45 years from now, 44 years from now. It's a long time from now. But I do think that the humanity is not really facing up to the challenges that we have. I think that there's climate change is going to continue to get worse. I just was with several people who do a lot of work with refugees and migrants. And I said, I've heard this number that by 2050, there might be 1 billion climate refugees from people being unable to support agriculture or different things. And they said that does seem still to be an accurate estimate. So that what that means is, and the fear and anxiety and the rise of authoritarianism and all of that the trauma is likely to continue to increase. Net zero trauma doesn't mean no trauma. There'll always be trauma.
And there needs to be trauma for us to evolve, right?
Yes.
It's part of life.
Yeah. Illness, accidents, death,
and
loss.
we need to go through some kind of trauma to learn and to be resistant as well, right? So it's like we do not want to say, oh, we will never be sick. No, but it just needs to be within boundaries.
Yeah, and can we stop adding to the burden of global? And what inspired me was Bhutan with gross national happiness.
Yes.
So I started thinking, and I've looked at the different domains of how they measure gross national happiness. And I said, what we need now is gross national trauma measure. So there are measures of democracy in different countries, the amount of cancer in different countries, the amount of people in prison in different countries. We have all these measures, but there's no measure of the burden of trauma in any particular country. So what I feel is that you need to combine idealism with practicality. So I want to, how do we measure if we are actually reducing the global burden of trauma? Well, we need a measure. So can we create this measure of gross national trauma and then use that over the next decades to chart progress? The number of refugees, the number of wars, the number of rapes, the number of sexual violence, the number of all these things. So
I can see that's interesting. There is one I could see possibly one weakness is that it's like a negative measure, right?
Yes.
So communicating a negative measure might be more difficult, might be more depressing. While on the other side, communicating gross national happiness is the positive side that might motivate people. Yeah. So perhaps one could say about creating some measure which would somehow measure the inverse. I don't know.
It's an interesting point because people shy away from negative things.
Yeah.
But there are measures of the burden of cancer, which is a negative thing.
For scientific purposes, for sure.
Maybe one day we'll get sophisticated enough that we could really do measures of people that have changed their epigenetic markers.
Okay.
So the number of people that are ready to pass on more positive perspectives on trauma to their children. But I see what you're saying about the switching. I don't know what that would be, like the absence of trauma or gross national. Well, here this raises an interesting point, which is that, again, we're here to, one of the other things I'm doing here is to talk about MDMA for couples therapy. The FDA has only approved drugs to treat illness in psychiatry, for depression, for anxiety, for PTSD. They've never approved anything for wellness or for flourishing.
For raise of consciousness.
Nothing. But there's nothing in the law that prevents the FDA from approving a drug for couples therapy, for something positive.
Okay.
That's good. We have expert lawyer scientists who specialize in suing the FDA. And we've done that twice, and we've won 2 formal disputes with FDA, one about our marijuana project, one about our MDMA project. And so we're preparing with these lawyers. Once we do this initial pilot study with MDMA for couples therapy, then we're going to go to the FDA with these lawyers and say, we want to challenge you, will you approve for couples therapy, which is part of wellness, not part of illness. And also a lot of what RFK Jr., the head of the HHS, the Health and Human Services, is talking about moving more towards preventative medicine, more towards thinking about promoting health rather than treating
This makes
illness.
a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is where I think MAPS' strong point is this idea of science and politics coming together, where there's political obstructions for certain things. So the biggest political obstruction is that American healthcare is about sick care. It's
But not healthcare.
Not about healthcare.
Yeah. It's same in Europe, in my country as well. This,
Yeah.
That's yet another discussion, but I fully agree. Yeah. So this is the couple therapy. Now we can have it even a community or a group therapy. Which is I know there are the trials, the projects to heal the Israeli-Palestine situation, where people from both Israel and Palestine come together under the treatment of perhaps MDMA.
Yeah, well, what's happened is that small groups of Israelis and Palestinians were doing ayahuasca and MDMA together.
Okay. At the same time?
No. Ayahuasca one time.
Separately. Okay.
Yeah. And usually the MDMA first, and then they would. And so once we noticed this, we said, wow, maybe we should study this. Maybe this should be bigger. For psychedelics couples therapy is almost like conflict. How do you help them deal with conflict? And then cultural conflict. How do you deal with Israelis and Palestinians who have all these prejudices about each other? Yes. And so there's more and more interest in this kind of more social impact of psychedelics, of feeling your common humanity. And then how do you dehumanize others? I had this one experience that really opened me up in this way that I remember now. I was 16 years old, and I was studying Russian in high school because my great-grandparents on my mother's side came from Russia to America in 1880. But also the Russians were trying to blow up America and stuff, or I thought. So I thought I'll study.
It's good to know about your enemy.
Yeah. So my parents, and this is actually a good story, how I got inspired to do the work I do. They sent me to Russia in the summer of 1970 after my junior year of high school, and they gave me Jewish prayer books, which were illegal in Russia. And they said, bring these to the synagogue if you can. So they trained me that if you can't do something big, these big factors are beyond any individual, but if you can do something little, you should do it. You still have an obligation to do something.
Yeah, it's a responsibility, yeah.
Yeah, so I ended up spending this summer in Russia, and we were studying Russian. There were 60 of us high school students. And at the place we went, there was this young Russian girl that was working at the restaurant where we would eat. And she and I went for a walk on the beach one time. And I was like, I thought you hate me. I thought you want to kill me. I thought all the Russians, are against all the Americans. And she's like, no, that's not the way it is. We're suffering under this government too. So to see a Russian who I was raised to fear, and to see that she was just another human being.
Yeah, same human beings. Yeah.
It just really changed it. And then I was approached by a lot of I'm sort of proud of this part, I was approached by young Russians in the black market. And so 1970, we have the psychedelic renaissance in America, the psychedelic culture. And so the Russians wanted to buy blue jeans, and they wanted to buy button shirts, and they wanted to buy anything that looked like America. And so me and two other guys would collect stuff from our 60 high school students, and we'd go sell it to the black market, and we'd take our cut. So I made thousands of rubles, which were worthless outside of Russia, because they didn't want anybody to escape with money. So I went to the synagogue, and I said, I've got this prayer books to give you, and I've got all this money to give you. And the guy's like, well, definitely we want it, but don't give it to us here because we're being watched right now. I'll meet you at the subway station at this time, at this place, and we'll make the transfer then. So I'm like, all right, now I'm James Bond.
Yeah.
This is exciting. And I'm some stupid little 16-year-old. If they catch me, they'll just send me home. So I did it. I met the guy in the subway station, made the transfer. And that was sort of my first underground activity, was against the Russians at the height of the Cold War. But also was this lesson from my parents that you need to be an activist. You need to do something. You can't just... And so much we disempower ourselves by saying, I can't do enough.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you can do a little, that's empowering. And so I think that led me to think when I started MAPS, it didn't look like it would ever work, like there was so much against it, but it didn't matter. It was something worthwhile to do, whether it succeeded or not. And that's, I think, one of the things that has led me to being able to do this for 40 years is that I focused on the effort and not on the outcome.
Yes, this is great. This is a similar view that Václav Havel would say. Let me paraphrase that. It makes sense to do things that we believe in, or that make sense to us, even though we don't know what happens.
Yes.
Yeah, even though we do not know the result, it might just not work out. And we may even see upfront, oh, there's very little chance, but we still do it because it's the only thing that makes sense.
Yeah.
So to me, this is like protection of freedom in general. It wouldn't make sense to live in a world that would be slavery under AI, where would be totally controlled and humans would be like animals in a cage.
Yeah.
So that's better, for me, would be better not to live. Right. So then, then I would do anything, even if the chance looks very little, I would still do it. And maybe you can say more about your experience, because you show so much courage in your life going for what you believe. Maybe and I also see that one of the big problems of today's world is that people are manipulated by fears.
Yes.
And it's so strong. So maybe you could give advice to people how to do it, how to overcome the fears, how to go for our visions from your own experience.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, one of the essences of what MDMA does is it reduces fear.
Yes.
It reduces activity in the amygdala, which is our fear processing part of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So
people are more open, they can say deep things, but it's local. It's not like a long-term image.
I think that what people often don't see is the consequences of doing nothing. So I think when you're fearful of doing something, look at the consequences of doing nothing. This creeping authoritarianism, if you don't object to it.
Yeah.
That's more frightening in many cases, the fear of doing nothing for me, than the fear of doing something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The other part of it is that fear is contagious, but so is courage. Mm-hmm. So if people, like with Václav Havel, you meant, people object to things, and then you suddenly see that other people have not been willing to speak out, but now they are. Mm-hmm. So that I think this idea of what we're scared about is to look at the fear of doing nothing. And often, for me at least, that's bigger than the fear of doing something. Then the other part of the courage is to realize, this is, I don't know if you know this quote. Father Bruno was an associate of Galileo.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Galileo. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happened was that when Copernicus and Galileo are saying that the Earth is not the center of the universe, that ran into problems with the church.
Yes.
And so Galileo was actually brought before the Inquisition, was sentenced to house arrest, and he had to recant what he had found.
What he said. Yeah.
Father Bruno was someone who both experimented with plant medicines, but also supported the idea that the Earth was not the center of the universe. And so he was brought before the Inquisition, and he was sentenced to burn at the stake.
Yes.
And what he said to the Inquisition is one of the most courageous things I've ever heard in my whole life. He said, "Your fear in sentencing me is greater than my fear in being sentenced."
So beautiful. Yeah. Giordano Bruno, we should take the words.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So much sense.
So I think once you do little things that take courage, then it builds your muscles for courage more. Yeah. So that you don't have to start by, something major that's going to cost you a lot. You can have courage in a small way.
Step by step. Yeah.
Say your mind instead of holding back. See what happens, and then you will see that you get more capacity for courage.
So yes, I believe it's about training. To train oneself to become more courageous step by step. Actually, for me, a part of it is also physical training. That one does things which you need to go out of comfort zone, like do saltos and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that also, to me, at least for me, it helps. So that would be my suggestion as well.
Yeah, and what I've found too, yes, the more your body is capable of doing things, the more your spirit is capable of doing things.
It's connected.
But I've found that the step for me is to, what is the worst that would happen? Just think, when you're about to do something, you're scared of doing something, what is the worst that would happen? And then can you live with that? And then if you can live with that, then you can go forward with more courage.
Yeah, or even can you can put up even with that, even if one does not live anymore, right?
Yes.
So that is, of course, what happens after life.
So I also learned a lot as I was growing up from what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. And so that was one of the few places where there was an uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising during World War II at the Nazis.
Yes.
But what I realized over time is all those people that were fighting against the Nazis, they all knew that they would all be killed and that they would not survive. But they had a choice. Do we want to die fighting, or do we want to die just not resisting at all? So that's where I think was enormous courage. They knew it was going to fail in the end. They knew that they would still end up dying, but it would be a signal to others to maybe start an uprising, or to, so that even when you think it's going to fail, there can be real good reasons for doing it, because then you die at least knowing that you've done your part.
The reasons are wider. The reasons are for the society, for our evolution, for our culture to survive. In fact, I believe that now we are in the test phase. If you make it as humanity, I call it social singularity, 21st century. And to me, it is pretty, from a big part, it's about courage. If people are able to take the responsibility to go behind what they believe and not to let themselves manipulate by fears. To me, this is the decisive moment, and I'm glad that there are tools like MDMA which can help us in these decisions. And to me, the sense of our life is creativity and people connecting together. But in order to be able to do that, we need to become more courageous as a society. That's my belief.
I think so, very much so. And also we need to be building bridges to people who think differently than us. So a lot of the things that I've done have been to reach out to the police, or reach out to various Republicans, or people who are on a different perspective than I am, but that maybe we can align on healing trauma, on healing people that are suffering. So the police, who I thought for a long time of my life, in some ways still the case, that the police are the predator and I'm the prey from my use of drugs. But at the same time, the police have some of the most difficult jobs in America, in the world, and they're often very traumatized, and they're not told to deal with their trauma. They're told to just stuff it down. So I've gone to the International Association of Chiefs of Police conference of 10,000 police chiefs and police senior people from all over the world. And we presented a small talk on MDMA therapy to healing trauma in veterans and police. And this was now during Trump's first term. And he decided to speak also at this International Association of Chiefs of Police just the day before. And they scheduled his time exactly the time that I was going to speak, several of us, about MDMA. So we get there, and there are thousands and thousands of people in a line to go see Trump. And we go to our room, which is for 350 people, and there's only 20 people there. But it turned out that one of them was a police officer who was also a therapist. And at the end of the talk, he said, someone that was in my unit has recently committed suicide. And if MDMA could help, I'd like to learn to be an MDMA therapist. So we said, sure, we will let you go through our training program. And he was featured, and this is part of changing the culture too. So Netflix documentary about Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. The one on MDMA ends with this particular police officer receiving MDMA in the legal protocol that we have to train therapists with their own MDMA experience. And he got approval from his police chief to be on the documentary. And so the whole end of it is a police officer receiving MDMA to help other police officers. So that message to society is so powerful. It's not just the criminals or it's not just the hippies. Now the police need it and the veterans need it. So it's to go where the suffering is in the culture. And if you can address that, then things can open up. So that's where I've been trying to reach out. And about, well, Rebecca Mercer, people may know that her family and she owned Cambridge Analytica, which was the company in England that scraped all the data from Facebook and used it with the Russians to try to target certain districts. But she offered $1 million for MDMA research. And her only condition was that it go to veterans. And I got lots and lots of criticism for taking money from Rebecca Mercer, who in many ways has done things that I don't agree with, and most everything I don't agree with, and said, I said, well, you're making her look good. She's doing something good. I said, well, people are not 100% good or 100% evil. If she wants to do good, let her do it. I want to help her do good. And so I had one opportunity with at a Passover Seder where in Boston, these friends of mine, our family friends, have these big Passover Seders. They're all major scientists.
Passover?
Passover,
yeah.
Yeah, so it's supposedly the Jews leaving Egypt and Moses, let my people. So it's a long dinner, lasts hours and hours. And we were sitting next to this couple that I didn't recognize, the elderly couple. And I said to them, are you a scientist? And he said, no, I'm a judge. And then his wife started talking about how she'd written a book about parents who have children with life-threatening illness and how you deal with the grief and how you deal with the emotions of having a child that might die. And so then we started talking about MDMA, and we started talking about the therapy that I'm doing. And then we started talking about marijuana for help for different things. And after a couple hours, I finally realized he's not just a judge, he's a U.S. Supreme Court judge. It was Stephen Breyer.
Wow.
And I said, are you the Stephen Breyer? He said, yeah. I said, well, I have an ethical question to ask you. And it's about building bridges with people on the other side. I said, I've been criticized for taking this money from Rebecca Mercer, but I think it was important to do. What do you say? And what he said was that the essence of democracy is trying to find common ground with people with whom you may disagree with on anything else, everything else, but you try to build on what you can share.
Yes.
And in this highly polarized world, there's not enough of that, and everybody is demonizing the other side, and they're not willing to look for common ground. And so I feel that the U.S. Supreme Court judge approved my approach for taking money from both sides, from Republicans. And now we have really good contacts inside the Trump administration for people who are pro-psychedelics.
Yes.
And we don't agree with them on much of anything else, but that we can agree on.
Indeed, we are being separated so much. We need to really do the opposite. And what I believe is that what is a really good strategy, even people with whom we cannot agree at all, try to look at the problem from their point of perspective, to just understand. And then there can be, I do have actually some experience with discussion when there is like totally polarized opinions, but after some talks, you try to understand the point of the person and you get to the essence of the misunderstanding. Usually it might be, okay, we don't understand here, but there is, both sides have a respect because it's just different opinions on subjects. So this I believe is just the healing that we need.
Yeah, I actually think that is the key, because to ask people to explain why they think something rather than saying, oh, I disagree with you, you're wrong. Why do you think that way? I think that is the most positive way to build a bridge and to understand each other. Exactly.
So, Rick, please, if you tell our audience where they can look at your work, at the great work that you have been doing, and how they can perhaps help and support or raise the voice.
Thank you. Well, our website is maps.org, maps.org, and we have, we have one of the first websites in the world, actually. We have an enormous amount of information. There was actually, in around 1994, there was a man, he contacted me, and he said that he and his wife had a tragedy. They had a son in his teenage years die in a motorcycle accident, and the only thing that helped them through this was MDMA to deal with their grief. And he said he wanted to offer MAPS a website. And I said, what's a website? So we were like the number 600 website in the world.
94. I remember I came to the US, my first time was fall 94. And there were already a website. It was right at the beginning.
So I would say that there's so much information on the MAPS website that people could learn all the projects, all what we're doing. We've had some major, we haven't mentioned this yet, but we've had the biggest conferences in the world in psychedelics. We had Psychedelic Science 2023, where we had 12,400 people. And we had Psychedelic Science 2025, where we had 8,000 people. But each of those, we had like 300 speakers. And all of those are videotaped, and they're all available for free on the website. So if you want to see the latest in all the different areas of psychedelic research, just go to the MAPS.org website for free, and you can access all of these talks and all of our protocols. I really believe in transparency. That's what we need. So we've got our protocols, we've got our communications with FDA, we've got the treatment manual, all different resources are there for people. And it's not just about MDMA.
Yeah.
We have a psychedelic bibliography of thousands of psychedelic papers, all sorts of things that to help people.
Great opportunity for people to learn and to overcome any possible fear from psychedelics, which are
Well, I guess I would say that there's a certain fear that's justified, because it's scary when you're letting go of how you normally see things. So, but it's not like paralyzing fear, but it's the fear of the unknown, that there's something. Here's what I learned in my Ibogaine trip. I did a combination of LSD and Ibogaine in 1985. It was one of the most important experiences of my life. But a lot of it was about this idea that this, doing new things, you're always making mistakes. And you're always having to learn from your mistakes. And during this experience, I learned that this self-critical part that many of us have is connected in me, and it was connected to this self-hatred. Like, oh, I should be better, I should be perfect, oh, I made all these mistakes, and then I'm down on myself.
Oh, yeah.
But what I realized is that I need to separate out the self-criticism from the self-hatred and make the self-criticism an ally for quality control. Yes. And so that's what I managed to do during this LSD Ibogaine experience.
This is great. Yeah.
I made this. So I think that this trying of new and the fear of doing new things, that we're not always going to do them right.
Yeah. And what also, in my experience, what we can to some level manage, if things that are coming, if they are negative, they are hard, just really look at it from the other side, what it brings us positive, and then we can really decrease the negativities in life.
Yeah. Actually, there's been some surveys that I just, about people that have been going through a psychedelic retreat. This is like 1,000 people surveys. And what they say over time is that when you sample them at the very beginning, like the few days afterwards, they talk about how hard things were. But over the weeks and months, they start talking about how much they learned from the hard things.
Yes.
Instead of just how hard it was, now it's, I learned so much from that. And I think that's generally what we see a lot about the psychedelic therapy, is that sometimes the biggest lessons are in the most difficult experiences.
So maybe let me thank you for this amazing talk, and let make our wishes for the world, for our world to heal from the worst traumas, and for us people to be able to understand each other, to support each other, and to make the giant jump in our evolution and become planet Earth, where people are connected and can support each other and be creative.
Yeah, I think that vision is achievable.
It is.
And I think if we have that vision, because we also think that a lot of the people that are with the opposing views, they're also suffering in different ways, and they have their own traumas, and how do we help them?
And people do suffer from negativities, right? It's so much better, even your opponent, to just try to talk to him or her and smooth out the boundaries. It's,
I think it was Gandhi that said this, but I'm not sure, but he said the real way, the only real way to defeat your enemy is turn them into your friend.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen.